Our next speaker is also from North America. Emmy Barth has been a name that has been quite prominent in Anabaptist studies, and we are so pleased that she can be here with us today. She's worked in archives, works as the archivist for the Bruderhof community, which she's part of. And I just want to warmly welcome Emmy to the stage.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for the way you've pulled this all together, this very diverse group. It's quite amazing. And I'm looking forward to everybody's presentations. What I'm going to talk about kind of relates to the previous presentation.
Do you have the clicker up there?
No, I don't.
This.
Okay, you can use that to move back and forth.
Okay. So when my talk is on this book known as the Great Article Book. How many people here have heard of it or know what I'm talking about? Only a handful. Okay, this is its actual title is in German Ein schön lustig Büchlein, etliche Hauptartikel unseres Glaubens betreffend. A lovely, delightful booklet concerning some of the main articles of our faith. It's a book that defends the Hutterites' beliefs on 5 topics: baptism, Lord's Supper, community, nonviolence, and government, marriage, and backing up their statements with Bible passages. It was published in German by Robert Friedman in 1967 in Glaubenszeugnisse über deutsche Taufgesinnte. And I've just translated the entire thing into English, and we hope to still publish it this year as part of the Classics of the Radical Reformation series. Friedman said about this book, "There is no doubt that the Hutterites considered this book, about 300 leaves in manuscript, of equal rank with Peter Riedemann's Great Rechenschaft unseres Glaubens. It was one of their main doctrinal statements, used both within the community and also as a source when dealing with the outside world, in order to demonstrate the biblical correctness of their particular teachings." And that goes back to what Jack was talking about. Leonard Gross devotes 4 pages to this text in his Golden Years of the Hutterites, as does James M. Stayer in the German Peasants' War. So you can see that everyone who has studied the Hutterites sees this as a very important text. And because of that, that is, I come from the Bruderhof, a newer Hutterite community, more evangelical than the evangelicals, perhaps. And we've been wishing to publish it for many years in English. And I was finally given this job a couple of years ago, and I've been working on it for quite a long time. Robert Friedman attributed it to Peter Walpott, who served as Hutterite bishop from 1565 until his death in 1578. And ever since that time, Peter Walpott's name has been associated with it. Friedman also gave it the title, The Great Article Book. But I don't like that name because I don't think an article book conveys anything to an English audience. And the original title is Ein schön lustig Büchlein. A more recent scholar, Matthias Gawert, who was co-author of the large catalog der Hutterischen Handschriften, published an article in the Mennonite Quarterly Review in 2009 in which he illustrates influences of Pilgrim Marpeck, who is an early Anabaptist who was not Hutterite. And he points out that the oldest copy comes from after Walpott's death. So he's suggesting that actually it wasn't Peter Walpott at all. So this is the title page of the copy that's in Bratislava, in one of the archives there. Does this have a pointer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here you can see the date, 1583. Here you can see Hans Zuckenhammer. He was a minister. And the man who copied it and possibly compiled it was Hauptrecht Sapp, who was the secretary of the ministers and of the bishops. Hans Zuckenhammer is first mentioned in the Chronicle in 1579, when he and another brother were arrested and imprisoned. He was appointed as minister in 1580 and ordained in 1585. And evidently, Hauptrecht Sapp copied this text for him. It's impossible to ascertain with any certainty who the author was, but as part of my project of translating the text, I obtained copies of 7 manuscript versions and compared them. Differences are minimal, a phrase here omitted or added, a word misread, but they don't change the meaning of the text. So this is a codex. A codex is a handwritten manuscript that's been made into a book. So this is the codex that's in Berlin, and this is the one that Robert Friedman used when he published it. Ein schön lustig Büchlein, etliche Hauptartikel unseres christlichen Glaubens. This is one that's in Bratislava. You could see that the first one I showed you is so much more beautiful and more professionally done. This is another one. This one is quite beautiful, but we only have one of them, we only have the baptism section. Here's the Inhalt und Register dieses Büchel. And here it gives you each of the sections, which I'll talk about later. Here again, you see the Register on the left side. And it says there, from wahren christlichen Taufe. So this is the section on baptism. This is another one from Hungary. And this is one that we have in the Bruderhof archive from 1610 that was given to Eberhard Arnold. So I actually went through all these 7 texts and compared them line by line. I have it all in graphs. I guess I'm passionate about this. And I compared whether there was changes in meaning or anything. So this is the Zuckenhammer Codex, which is what Friedman called it because it was made for Hans Zuckenhammer. And after studying these other copies, it seems clear that this is the official version and the others are copies of it. This is a page of the Chronicle, and this is to show Hauptrecht Sapp, who copied this one. This is the Vorräte, and at the bottom, it's signed by Caspar Breitmichel, ein Diener Jesu Christi und seine Gemein, nach ihm Hans Krill und sein Schreiber Hauptrecht Sapp von Sprendling, Fortführer und Arbeiter an diesem Buch. That's on the Chronicle. This is pages from the Chronicle to compare that it's the same handwriting. And these are initials from the article book. Here you can see the year, 1583, and the initials, HZ. And similarly here, which I can't see from this angle, but somewhere in here. Yeah, okay. So Hauptrecht Sapp was also ordained as a minister in 1594. And during the persecutions of 1620, he was among those who fled from Moravia to Sabatish here in Slovakia. And he died in 1630 at the age of 84. The Chronicle says about him, he was a zealous worker for the Lord, a member of the church for about 70 years, And for nearly 37 years, a servant of the gospel, he was also the elder secretary for more than 30 years. So if this is the great article book, there are also some small article books. The small one is attributed to Peter Walcott in Hutterite sources. And some copies are very small so that they would be easy to take on a mission trip. And the early Hutterites were very active in mission. So this one is only 3.5 by 2 inches. We have it in our archive in Fox Hill. And you can see it was made to be taken on a trip. In the second half of the 16th century, so this is 50 years after the beginning of the Hutterites. Jakob Hutter was executed in 1536. Now in the 1580s, they're having to, and Astrid described this very well, they're having to put their faith, which was very evangelical and free and led by the Spirit, they're having to write it down and put it in, put a form to it. And there's forms for baptisms and forms for marriages and forms for ordinations. And that probably slowly came more and more firm in the 1580s under Peter Walcott. And under his direction, they built up a scriptorium of sorts where the letters and songs of their martyrs and defenses of their beliefs were copied. Missionaries were regularly sent out to other regions of German-speaking Europe. They walked into danger, and several were imprisoned and even executed. In order to provide them with answers, should they be interrogated regarding their faith, Walcott wrote a defense and provided arguments on 5 topics: baptism, Lord's Supper, communal living, government, and marriage. These arguments were copied into small books which missionaries carried with them. Known as the Small Article Book, this missionary version is significantly shorter than Ein schön lustig Büchlein. In Hutterite sources, it is clearly attributed to Peter Walcott. It was incorporated into the Hutterian Chronicle after 1547 as the 5 articles that are the reason for the great controversy between us and the world. And here's one more small one from our archive in Fox Hill. So Robert Friedman assumes that the Small Article Book was excerpted from the larger work, but I think it's more likely that the Great Article Book was a later expansion. It includes arguments from martyrs imprisoned much later. It's quite different from Peter Riedemann's Rechenschaft, which Riedemann wrote while in prison. The Rechenschaft is plainly the work of one man, written in a uniform style. In contrast, I've been able to trace the arguments of the Great Article Book to numerous other Anabaptists. Also, each of the 5 sections has a somewhat different audience in mind and is written in a different tone. Another indication that it is not the work of a single author. Friedman notes that passages in the section on baptism are taken from Balthasar Hutmeyer. And Rauert points out numerous passages that can be traced to the influence of Pilgrim Marpeck. Both Hutmeyer and Marpeck were well-known Anabaptist theologians, but they were not Hutterites. I've traced passages to a number of other Anabaptists. It seems clear that this is not the work of a single author. The voice, tone, and audience is constantly shifting. I suggest that this delightful book was a collaborative effort. Pertinent arguments on the topics at hand were collected from various sources. In the words of Matthias Rauert, it was a kind of index file consisting of a collection of excerpted notes. Evidently, Hutterite scribes combed through the arguments of their own theologians, the letters and trial accounts of their martyrs, as well as the writings of other Anabaptists who were not of their denomination. A number of their arguments can be traced to the interrogations of men imprisoned in the 1560s. Each section ends with a historical overview based on Sebastian Frank's Chronica, as well as mentioning others from the Reformation, Zwingli, Calvin, Martin Luther. The topics of baptism and the Lord's Supper in particular were disputed by reformers of all stripes. There were no copyright laws, and it seems to have been common practice to borrow other people's words, so that it is no longer possible to identify the original author of a given idea. In addition, the Hutterites' desire for humility and Gelassenheit, to be crushed as the grapes and ground as the wheat used in the wine and bread of the Lord's Supper, meant that an individual was not to stand out, and many wrote anonymously. In fact, the first printed edition of Peter Riedemann's Rechenschaft did not have his name on it. The section on baptism illustrates from the Gospels that being baptized must be a conscious decision based on personal faith. Baptism means repentance and rebirth into a new life, and therefore is not indicated for children who belong to Christ already. The church hierarchy of the 16th century was notoriously corrupt, and the Hutterites assumed that those who baptized infants, as well as the godparents who were supposed to believe on behalf of the children, were living in sin. Infant baptism is called a Zudelbad, or a mud bath, an abomination, and the Wüste Gräuel, devastating sacrilege of Daniel. Yeah. Okay, this is the section on baptism. On the right-hand side, you can see vom wahren christlichen Tauf. The arguments expressed in this section are not original. Balthasar Hutmeyer is referred to and quoted multiple times, as well as Leonard Schiemer and Hans Schlaffer, who were both executed in 1528 and therefore pre-Hutterite. This is part of the baptism section, and in the red circle there on the right is a reference to Balthasar Hutmeyer. So in this paragraph, he's actually quoting Hutmeyer and actually citing him, giving him credit for the argument. Other non-Hutterites included, without being named, are Pilgrim Marpeck, Christoph Freisleben, and Menno Simons even. Christoph Freisleben was not a Hutterite. He came from Wels and was probably influenced by Hans Hut, although he later returned to the Catholic Church. In addition, I was able to trace some of the arguments to the following later prisoners: Peter Riedemann, Paul Glock, Bernhard and Max Klampfer, Hans Arbeiter, Klaus Felbinger, and Leonard Dax. So they collected all these different arguments and they put them in the order of the Bible, so it works through the Bible. But because it's from so many sources, it's not one continuous argument. Okay, the section on the Lord's Supper. Vom Abendmahl Christi und wie das Sakrament der Pfaffen da wieder ist. Like the section on baptism, the one on the Lord's Supper is directed against the Catholic hierarchy. And like baptism, the Hutterites' interpretation was similar to that of other Anabaptists. The Lord's Supper is to be celebrated as a memorial to Christ's suffering. Many reformers argued about the actual presence of Jesus' flesh and blood in the bread and wine. There are echoes of Zwingli's arguments in his 3 articles on the Lord's Supper. And this is a page on the Lord's Supper section, and there in the margin is a reference to the Bern dispute. So again, they're taking other people's ideas. In addition, Balthasar Hutmeyer and Hans Langenmantel, who was executed in 1529, and Paul Glock are quoted. Then there's a section on community, von der wahren Gelassenheit und christlichen Gemeinschaft der Güter. This section on community quotes Wolfgang Brandhuber, who was a pre-Hutterite executed in 1529, Leonard Dax, and Peter Walpott's letter to the Swiss Brethren of 1577. Because living in community was unique to the Hutterites and differentiated them from the Swiss Brethren and the Mennonites, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. In this article book, the section on community is directed in part to false brothers, fellow Anabaptists who did not live in community. In that way, it's different in tone to the first two sections that are directed against Catholic practice. It might be true that the practice of community began as a practical solution to assure that the limited means were shared with all. However, it soon became a basic tenet for which the Hutterites were ready to die, as illustrated in the following incident. At the end of 1539, 150 Hutterite men were arrested in the community in Steinebrunn and told that they could be released if they would dissolve their communities. Peter Riedemann wrote to them, "Dear brothers, we answer as we did before. They only want to destroy the community, but it is the work of the Lord, and we cannot and will not agree to their demands. However many the Lord in heaven brings together, be it many or few, we want to live together and not give in to human rules and regulations or make such rules. Do not let anything shake you, dear brothers. They are trying to lead you astray." And a year later, Hans Amann, who is the bishop following Jakob Hutter, wrote, "Dear brothers, we are still living in Moravia, but we have heard that all those who remain in community will be driven out. We want to die with God's help rather than abandon community." So already by 1540, living in community had become essential to who they were. Then there's a section on nonviolence and attitude to government. Today, many people, including Mennonites, and at least at some times in our history, the Bruderhof, have felt that to be peacemakers means standing up against violence and injustice in the form of protests. The Hutterites did not consider such actions their place. According to their interpretation, the secular government is under the law of the Old Testament and is entitled to use the sword to keep crime at bay. However, Christ has given a new command to love one's enemy and turn the other cheek. Christians should expect persecution and be ready to be killed. In contrast to the government, Christians are given the keys of the ban to exclude evil from the church and offer the evildoer a chance to repent. Christians are to be humble, to be like children, so it is impossible for them to take positions of rulership. They are not to judge as Christ refused to judge. Like Jesus, Christians should be ready to suffer and be killed rather than to kill others. Can you forward it one? Okay, the last section is on marriage. It's about half as long as the other four sections. And again, I'd like to speak a little more about marriage. The title is Marriage and Separation Between Believing and Unbelieving Partners. By today's standards, it seems cruel and unreasonable to demand that new converts leave their wife or husband if a spouse will not join them. But this is what the early Hutterites expected. This section seems to have been written in response to criticism of cases where a Hutterite mission traveled outside of Moravia and converted only one partner in a marriage. The convert was urged to leave his or her home and join the fellowship. It must be remembered that the Anabaptists were also ready to be imprisoned, tortured, and executed for their faith. Theirs was an age of absolutes. Baptism meant the salvation of their souls, and failure to follow the commands of Jesus meant damnation. Jesus spoke of the outer darkness where there is gnashing of teeth, and said that those who made excuses would not taste his banquet. So they had they had biblical basis for this demand. Anyway, this is just a brief introduction. Obviously, I can't say everything I would like to. You'll have to read more when the book comes out. The last image comes from the front of the book. At the bottom, down here, es ist nur ein Weg. There is only one way, one light, one life, one teaching of Christ. This is what the Hutterites believed, that there was only one way to follow Jesus, and this is what they were defending.
Emmy, thank you so much. From somebody else who loves manuscripts, you are a kindred spirit.
Thank you.
So, I, of course, have questions, but I want to open up the floor. Maybe before I do that, could you tell in a few sentences, for people who have no idea what the Bruderhof is, what this means when you talk about this?
Okay. The Bruderhof was began by Eberhard Arnold and his wife in 1920 in Germany, following the First World War, as an alternative to the injustice and war and violence they had experienced in Germany. They were inspired by the Sermon on the Mount and said, we have to find a way to live the way Jesus wants us to live. So they left their comfortable home in Berlin and went to a little village in Germany and started living in community. Only a few years later did they realize that the Hutterites had been living in community for 400 years. And in 1930, Eberhard traveled to Canada, visited every colony. He had to convince them to accept him into the Hutterian church. He believed, and I think he was right, that without the solid basis that the Hutterites were able to give, that his community would not survive the tests of time. So over the years, times we've been closer together, times we've been further apart, but we still believe that the Hutterites are our forebears. We share the same vows, the same basis of faith.
And you now have a few communities in Europe, correct?
There's 2 in Austria. The one I've been staying at is only an hour and a half away in Retz in Austria. And then there's 1 in Germany, 2 in England, and quite a few in America.
Okay, thank you so much.